Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to my February wrap-up. Today I'm going to talk about all the books that I read in the month of February. So I have 8 things to talk to you about today, and we will start off as usual with the classics. This month I reread Pride and Prejudice, which was an utter joy, just such a joy. I listened to this on audiobook. There is a Audible edition narrated by Rosamund Pike, which is available for Whispersync, when if you have the Kindle edition you can get the audiobook for about £2 or £3. And oh, it was such a good audiobook, and it was so nice to listen to Pride and Prejudice on audiobook because it's a book I've read, I don't know, 4 or 5 times and I know really, really well, so it was nice to experience it in a different fashion. Pride and Prejudice is pretty common and you probably do know the basic premise, but if you don't, it is about 5 sisters, particularly about the eldest 2 sisters of the 5. Their father is a gentleman, he owns a substantial amount of property, but it is all entailed on the male line, which means none of his daughters can inherit, and the house and the land and the money will go to the nearest male relation, which means unless his daughters find fairly wealthy people to marry, they're not really going to have any way of supporting themselves. I love Jane Austen a lot. I find her writing so witty and so enjoyable, and I find her character development and her exploration of Regency society and of manners and morals of marriage and women's position in society just so interesting. I'm so glad I own the audiobook. I'm sure I will listen to it many times again in the future. Pride and Prejudice is my favourite Jane Austen, though there are many others that I love. It was also really nice to reread a Jane Austen after having recently read Helena Kelly's The Secret Radical, and I'll link down my review video on that below. In general, I disagree with Helena Kelly, and it was interesting to kind of look at the things that she had constructed her arguments about in Pride and Prejudice and sort of disagree with her in my mind more while reading this and sort of think more closely about her arguments. And yeah, just a wonderful read as always. I love this book a lot, and it was really, really nice to reread it on audiobook. I also reread another absolute favourite classic of mine this month, and that is Anthony Trollope's The Way We Live Now. This was my 3rd reading, but I haven't read it since I was about 18, so it was really, really lovely to reread it this month. Though it did take up most of my month because it is quite a long one, and I buddy read this with Amanda Center and Marissa from Blatantly Bookish. I'll link their channels down below. I think they're not quite finished as well I'm filming this, but they are nearing the end, and it's been really lovely to discuss it with them, especially as this is my 3rd reading and this is their 1st. I love this book an awful lot. It is my favourite Anthony Trollope book, and I think it's so wonderful. It's kind of Dickensian in form in that we have a lot of characters and a lot of subplots, but the book kind of focuses around this fortune possessed by the Melmotte family. Mr. Melmotte turns up in London with a wife and a daughter and a lot of money, and no one knows where he's got his money from or where he's from or if he's got his money in a moral and legal fashion, but everyone flocks to them because they have money and they become the new kind of big thing in society. And it's about Mr. Melmotte and his kind of capitalist ventures, but it's also about his daughter and the men who want to marry her, and it's also about a family called the Carberys, Lady Carbery and her son and daughter Felix and Hetta, and so many other characters. It's really, really wonderful. I find the way it deals with like Victorian capitalism and money and sort of class versus respectability and issues of marriage and duty and women and men's position within society really, really interesting. I love Anthony Trollope's writing. I love the realism of his characters, and yeah, this was such a joy to reread, and I have decided that I think it is my favourite novel by Anthony Trollope over The Small House Allington. I love The Small House Allington, but I think this is a slightly more ambitious novel in a way, and I find the stuff it has to say about money so interesting and so fascinating, and that's why I love it so much. I read this partly for my Not So Hypothetical Victorian Literature course series, where in April I'll be talking about this and Our Mutual Friend and comparing the way that these books talk about money. I'm really, really excited to make that video because I love it a lot. And in fact, I have written an essay previously for my A-levels, and when I was 18 I wrote an essay on The Way We Live Now and Our Mutual Friend, comparing the way they present marriage, so it'll be nice to return to comparing them. But anyway. And then one very tiny classic I squeezed in this month, Gooseberries by Anton Chekhov. This is one of the Penguin Little Black Classics that came out quite a few years ago now, and this was the last one that I owned that I hadn't read yet. Someone asked me in my Q&A recently about Chekhov's short stories, and it just put me in the mood for reading some more of his short stories. I do have a big proper collection that's like 350 pages, but it's not here. I think it's at Nick's parents' house when I lent it to him when we were both still students, maybe. But anyway, there are 3 stories in here. I don't think I'd read any of them before. I certainly hadn't read the first 2 before, but it's possible that I might have read Gooseberries, the title story, before. I'm not sure. This was really interesting. I really love Chekhov's writing, and I think his short stories are very, very powerful, often in their, not exactly cynicism, but often they have quite sort of bleak endings in a way that I think is quite effective and something I really, really enjoy. I must say I preferred the first two stories in this, The Kiss and The Two Volodovas, to The Gooseberries itself. But Chekhov is one of those writers I find where if I read like 3 stories by him in a row, by the time it gets to the 3rd story, I'm not focused on it because I'm thinking about the other 2 stories. But still, really, really enjoyable, and I do enjoy a little tiny Penguin Black classic. It's always nice to read something in full in one go. I then read The Power by Naomi Alderman. I have a lot of thoughts on this one, and so I'm going to make an individual book review on this, by which I mean I just filmed the segment in my wrap-up on The Power and it ended up being about 15 minutes long and I realised it ought to be a separate video. But to put it simply, I didn't like The Power at all. I don't have a physical copy as I borrowed it off a friend and I've given it back to her, and my friend that I borrowed it off didn't love The Power either, and we had like a really good chat about why neither of us loved it. But apart from her and Petra Yu, whose channel I'll link down below, I haven't really found anyone else who didn't adore The Power, or at least didn't enjoy it. But for me it really fell short. If you don't know the premise, it's about what happens when women suddenly discover that they can shoot electric from their hands, meaning that they are now physically stronger than men, and it's about how this changes society. For me, I didn't love the writing. I found it not very engaging, a little bit boring. My main issue with it, I think, was that it was too ambitious, it stretched too far, which meant that nothing was gone into in detail. It spans 10 years, it has a lot of different characters, and for me, we didn't really get to know any of the characters, we didn't really get to sympathise with them or appreciate their situations enough, or really understand what was going on in the world, because everything was spread so thinly and she tried to cover so much ground. So not one for me, but like I said, I'll make an individual review of it discussing my thoughts in a bit more detail. From a modern novel that I liked a lot more, and one also I think that I had middling expectations of, this is Nellie Dean by Alison Case. This is a Wuthering Heights retelling, a retelling from the perspective of Nellie Dean, and if you've read Wuthering Heights, you know that Wuthering Heights is from the perspective of Nellie Dean, but it's not about Nellie Dean. It is a kind of over-the-shoulder narrative where Nellie Dean narrates to a man called Mr. Lockwood the lifetime of her old master, Mr. Heathcliff. This book was really, really interesting. I was quite curious to read it because I find Nellie Dean a really interesting character, and the absence of her own kind of personal life and emotions in the story of Wuthering Heights is something I'm quite interested in, and kind of filling in the gaps is quite curious. So I was very interested to read this, though I didn't have that high expectations, and yet I loved it. I loved it so much. This is such an enjoyable, engaging and fascinating read. It takes one central premise, one kind of not exactly conspiracy theory of Wuthering Heights, but a theory of Wuthering Heights that Nellie Dean feels towards Hindley kind of as Heathcliff feels towards Cathy. And one of the reasons why I wanted to read this book was that I agree with that, and I do think there is some evidence in the text of Wuthering Heights. Nellie Dean talks about the fact that Hindley was her foster brother. She's always fairly emotionally attached to him and to the whole Earnshaw family, and at one point she goes to a particular place and says that she and Hindley held at a favourite spot several years before when they were children, suggesting that their relationship as children was much closer than what we actually see in the book of Wuthering Heights. And this book is about Nellie Dean, her relationship with Hindley, with her relationship with Hareton, and Cathy and Heathcliff are kind of in the background, but they're not the main focus of this. Hindley and Nellie are. There were a lot of reasons why I love this, partly because I think that Alison Case knows and loves Wuthering Heights and gets Wuthering Heights. There's something about this book that feels like Wuthering Heights, and I don't just mean the fact that it is set in Wuthering Heights and that it takes the story and the characters, but she gets Nellie Dean's voice right. And I don't know how, because there are some bits in this book that feel slightly too modern. The dialogue is not as 19th century as the dialogue in Wuthering Heights, but somehow she captures the voice of Nellie Dean really, really well, and she uses phrases every now and then that are quotes or paraphrases of stuff in the book, which means that it does feel like you're reading an extension of Wuthering Heights. As I mentioned earlier, I did a review recently of Jane Austen, The Secret Radical by Helena Kelly, a book that I didn't like because it had so many kind of conspiracy theories, I guess, about Jane Austen, and I think Jane Austen is so precise a writer that it's quite hard to have accurate conspiracy theories about her. But Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights is a vague and weird book with gaps and holes and time that passes very, very rapidly sometimes and very slowly at other times. There are lots of holes which you can fill if you want, and this book does it wonderfully. Previously I've read retellings or kind of spin-offs of books that for me either didn't work because they didn't feel close enough to the book and to the original characters, for example Death Comes to Pemberley by P.D. James, or I liked but I have to consider separately from the original book. For example, Jean Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea. I like it, I love Jane Eyre, I don't really like to think of them as being connected, weird as that may sound. But this really, really worked. Everdeen's character is so well formed, and the various other kind of secrets and plot twists going on in this are just wonderful. So I highly, highly recommend this if you're a fan of Wuthering Heights, and if you're up for the possibility that Nellie might have had an interesting relationship with Hindley and so on. Really, really fantastic, really, really wonderful. Just can't recommend this enough. Fascinating and wonderfully surprising read. Next I have a short story collection. This is For the Love of a Good Woman by Alice Munro. I really, really enjoyed this collection, and I can't believe it's taken me so long to read some Alice Munro. She writes about stressful, dramatic things in a really calm way, which makes it kind of calm but even more poignant to read. Most of these stories are set in kind of 50s and 60s, rural or small town Canada, and they're really, really fascinating, dealing with a variety of topics, some about motherhood, some about divorce and affairs, one about abortion, which is one of my favourites actually. That was a really, really, really strong story. One about some children that find a dead body and everything that goes on from there. And yet she writes all of these dramatic things with such a calm, beautiful writing style, and she has such focused descriptions of people and places that I just absolutely fell in love with this. It was quite a slow read in that sense because her writing is so rich, but I'm really, really glad that I read this, and it was really, really enjoyable. I would definitely recommend reading some Alice Munro if you like short stories, especially if you like longer short stories, as this contains quite a few longer stories in it. But I did really, really love it a lot, and I would highly recommend it. Next I have a prose poetry zine, let's say, to talk about, and that is Sentimental Ashtray by Weena Wonders. Weena is a writer and a fellow booktuber. I'll link her channel down below, and I always really, really love her poetry and her prose poems. I think they're absolutely wonderful, and she recently released a zine in physical form in the Philippines, on ebook in the rest of the world, and also on her website, and it's really, really, really brilliant. I'll put a link down below to where you can read it in full on her website, and also see the way that she laid it out on the page, because she's taken photographs rather than just put the text, which I really, really like. I love the way that although it's kind of very small pieces of somewhere between flash fiction and prose poems and little vignettes, it does also feel like there is a story going through the whole zine, and that there are themes and sort of characters, I suppose, in common. It's really, really beautiful written, really, really interesting, exploring issues of sexuality and love and relationships. I will link that down below, and I would definitely recommend you go checking out that and also Weena's channel. A very rare occurrence, I also read a graphic novel this month. This is The Thrilling Adventures of Lovelace and Babbage by Sydney Padua. This is quite an interesting graphic novel, and it is about two real people, Ada Lovelace and Charles Babbage, who lived in the early 19th century. This effectively takes their life and says, okay, here's an alternative universe in which Ada Lovelace didn't die young, in which Charles Babbage was more successful with his inventions, and in which they team up to use their mathematical brains to fight crime, which is really, really fun, and it's a really, really enjoyable read, but also full of lots of like historical in-jokes, and Dickens is in there and stuff like that, which makes me happy. So I really enjoyed this. I should say that I am not in general a graphic novel person, and I do find them quite hard to follow, and I think that's partly because I'm not used to them, and if I read more I will probably get more used to the way that you read graphic novels, but I did find bits of this kind of hard to read or hard to navigate, or I found myself getting slightly lost because my eyes don't know which bit to look at first. But I did really, really enjoy this, and I would recommend it if you're interested in this kind of thing. If you like Kate Beaton and that kind of like historical comic stuff, then I think you will quite enjoy this as well. Those are the 8 things that I finished in February. Now, as I did a kind of cozy-a-thon / February TBR at the beginning of the month, I also thought I would mention the 3 things I said in there that I'd be reading this month that I haven't finished this month. One is Northern Lights by Philip Pullman, which Nick and I are still listening to, so that is an ongoing current read. Another was War and Peace, which hasn't happened this month, but I think I'm gonna have to get myself a Kindle edition because I don't think my giant copy is working for me if I can't take it on my commute with me, but there we go. And the third is The Secret History by Donna Tartt, which I am currently reading. I started this on the last day of February, and I am curious to see what I think of this in the end. Currently, I am not loving it. I'm reading this for a book club, otherwise I don't think I would have ever picked this up because I really didn't like Donna Tartt's The Goldfinch. So far, I am enjoying this more than The Goldfinch as a whole, but I'm also aware that I remember I liked the beginning of The Goldfinch more than the rest of it. I think Donna Tartt has a brilliant, brilliant talent for creating very realistic, dislikable, insufferable characters. The problem is that they're so realistic that I find them insufferable. So I'm curious to see how I feel with the rest of this. I know a lot of people love this book, and I know it's been highly recommended to me from a lot of different sources. And one of the things I think I struggle with about Donna Tartt's books is that she has in there elements that I love, combined with writing style that I don't love and characters that really, really bother me, which means overall the package kind of annoys me even more because I feel like I should like the stuff in there that I like, but it's kind of interrupted by the stuff I don't like. I don't know if that makes sense, but I am curious to read on to the end of this. I'm definitely going to try and finish it and see what I think of it, so I'll report back with my thoughts on this at the end of March. There we have it, those are my February reads. Let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them. I'm especially curious if anyone else has read Nellie Dean by Alison Case and what you thought of that, and also other people who didn't like The Power. I know there are a few of you on Goodreads, and it would be nice again to feel that I'm not alone because that book has been receiving so much love and I have no love to give it. So that's it for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.